At the University of Toledo, we are surrounded by experts. And we tap into those experts here on Rocket Talk.
Critical race theory in the classroom has become a lightning rod of a topic over the last year. According to the Washington Post, 27 states are currently considering legislation that would put restrictions on how race can be taught in schools. Some legislation involves requiring teachers to make lesson plans available to the public in advance, allowing parents to opt their children out of lesson plans they find objectionable, and pulling funding for schools who cover divisive topics in certain ways. These proposed legislative changes have resulted in protests, counter-protests, tense school board meetings, and hours of political punditry. But what is critical race theory? And what are the educational impacts of those proposed legislative changes and the discourse around it? Here to discuss these issues are Mungo, Assistant Professor of Sociology, and Lynne Hamer, Professor of Education. Welcome to you both. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's start with the obvious question. What is the definition of critical race theory? We're going to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about it. So what is it?
So critical race theory is a theoretical explanation or a lens, if you will, to view how the historical uses of race in our country have modern day consequences, right? So going through, conquest and nation building and law creation, and how all of that historically has led to modern day consequences and inequality.
It's a nice, succinct answer. And so, on your face, but that certainly doesn't sound too objectionable to me. What's going on in the context of education here? What are people finding objectionable that's resulting in this conversation?
Well, the impacts of our historical racism are certainly felt tracing up through segregation, desegregation, and to the present. So what critical race theory does is it gives us a lens, as Munita said, to focus on why this works this way in schools. And one of the big pieces in my mind of critical race theory is that it challenges the idea that was rooted in civil rights legislation that we have to show intentionality on an individual's part in order for a charge of racism to stick. There's a problem there. To show intentionality, you have to get in my brain, and we can't do that. A further problem is that racism is so ingrained culturally that even if you could get in my brain, it might not show up as individual intention. It's just my understanding of the world and how it works. And so what that results in is a white supremacist curriculum. Those are kind of harsh words, but we don't learn anything about the African continent, for instance. It's just a blank, and that's biased. And we see disciplinary actions being particularly harsh to the point of physical violence against kids of color in a disproportionate way. And even my own child was able to notice that dress code in their school was enforced against the black kids and not against the white kids. So it's there. The students know it. The teachers, if they think about it, know it. We all know it, but we don't like to think about it because we're so afraid of being called a racist as an individual that we can't say, no, it's not the individuals, it's the system, and we just have to work together to do that. And critical race theory helps us do that.
Topics about race have been difficult to talk about for a long time in our country now. Like, what's going on at this moment? We've all seen these YouTube videos of these, board meetings that seem very tense, and people are yelling, and and all of these states working on this kind of legislation all at the same time. Like, what's going on at this particular moment that's really driving this conversation?
Misinformation. So the definition I just gave you for critical race theory is not the definition that's being used for this legislation. It's being used as a tool to further divide and misinform parents that their children are being taught things that blame them, things that make them feel uncomfortable and guilty of America's original sin. And that's not the case. And so the definition that I gave you is not the definition of critical race theory that's being talked about in the media, that's being talked about in board meetings that's being talked about even in the political walls. It's a different definition.
What does that definition look like? Do you mean?
It blames educators. It blames anyone who's trying to teach the truth, the hard history of America and America's coming to be the greatest power. Anyone who teaches what actually happened as being anti-American or anti-patriotic, and that's not the case.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And
and also magnification of a relatively few voices. Just this weekend, CBS released a poll where about 85% of Americans feel that that racism should be taught about, and that books should not be banned. That's a pretty high number. Only 23%, according to their poll, had any concern over over children learning, quote, white guilt. And so it was a co-optation of this term because critical race and theory are three really scary words to us. So it's politically exceedingly effective, and that's it is out of control.
And Lynn, I wonder if you could speak to this. So a lot of this legislation, it has practical effects, right? It does real things and restricts, and right. So funding can be threatened. Lesson plans have to be available. How does this kind of legislation impact the educational experience? Does it make for a worse educational or pedagogical experience for teachers, students?
Well, two things. Currently, a lot of teachers, just like citizens at large, don't even know this is happening. Even the really well-informed ones who are very involved, because it's such an obscure thing to have happen. No one would have ever dreamed that the legislature would do this, let alone across the country do it. The second thing, it does have real effects. I had a student last semester. Number one, I had 25 students, juniors, who were out in the field in the area schools and placements. None of them had a cooperating teacher who had even heard of this. So we're really working to get information out, because as soon as somebody hears about it, it's like, this is terrible. Even people who would call themselves conservative see it. It's an attack on freedom of speech. It's anti-democratic, unconstitutional. The effect, though, I had one student who her cooperating teacher had been hauled into the principal because a parent had complained that she was teaching CRT, that's, and what she had done was she had assigned a short story by an indigenous author. So that's, as Munita was saying, that's nothing to do with critical race theory. That's just flat out white supremacy. The effect, though, my student changed from teaching a short story by an African-American author to teaching one by a cisgender white canonical male. So it's a hugely chilling effect. The implications for teachers are huge. They can lose their license. So the so-called watering down of this legislation was to say that teachers would not be sued in court, but they will still lose their license. So that's their livelihood, and so it's huge.
I think one more impact that gets often, not talked about is the impact on the children of color.
Absolutely.
Because in essence, what this legislation is doing is saying that children of color's feelings are not important, right? Because the history that they currently learn does not take their feelings into context, right? To be able to learn the history that gets taught now that overlooks their ancestors' contributions to making this country great. So in order to say that history can't be taught does segregate a whole population of children, and it ends up those are children of color.
And so how, if you think of someone, maybe a teacher who's caught in the crosshairs of this and feels like is sympathetic to what you're saying, what are suggestions that you would say for making the case for teaching these concepts in the classroom?
My approach is that we're hitting Afrocentrism hard. Afrocentrism does not say Europe is negligible. Afrocentrism says that we are a pluriversalist society and there are many centers, and so African history and literature should be taught. If we can get beyond, we're kind of stuck at this place where we're getting better at teaching the true history of the world, but we need to just get a little bit better at it so that it doesn't feel controversial. So that's one of the things I'm doing and teaching my students to do, and they're very hopeful that they will be able to do that.
Well, we only have about a minute left here, and I'm going to ask a question that we could probably, spent the entire time talking about. But what does this conversation tell us, do you think, about the state of race in America?
That it is still a very controversial subject, and that there are large structures in place to keep racial reconciliation efforts, down. And the only way that we can move forward as a society is to talk about the impact of race, which began here, and its consequences for present day America. And until then, we're going to stay in this state of upheaval.
Well said. And that is about all the time that we have today. But I want to thank you both so much for being here today. Really interesting conversation around a really important topic. So thank you both.
Thank you.
And that's all the time that we have. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next Rocket Talk.